October 1943. The skies over Germany are heavy with the clouds of war. The roar of engines fills the air as a massive formation of American B-17 Ja-2 flying fortresses takes flight, crossing the English Channel on their way to strike deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. Below, the German Luftwaffe's elite pilots, aces who had been trained to dominate the skies, watch with growing unease as the unmistakable silhouettes of the B-17s emerge on the horizon. For years, these skilled pilots had fought to maintain control of the skies above Germany. But now, as the American bombers approach, they find themselves facing a new kind of enemy, a force that cannot be easily broken. The B-17, with its powerful engines, heavy armor, and armament, is a formidable foe. And this particular squadron is a part of the U.S. Army Air Force's strategic bombing campaign, a mission that would prove to be a game-changer. As the B-17s soar overhead, their defensive gunfire creates a deadly barrier, while their sheer numbers make them nearly impossible to stop. The German pilots, who had once seen themselves as the masters of aerial combat, are now forced to confront the brutal reality that their dominance in the skies is coming to an end. The German aces, the very men who had once struck terror into the hearts of Allied pilots, now find themselves overwhelmed by a new kind of warfare, a battle they were not prepared for. The B-17s, impervious to their attacks and surrounded by a well-coordinated defense, are a living symbol of the changing tide of war. For the aces, many of whom had never before seen a challenge like this, the sight of the B-17s soaring over their skies is a moment of shock and disbelief, a sign that the war and the skies they once owned were no longer theirs to command. By late 1943, the war had reached a critical turning point. Germany, once dominant in the skies over Europe, was beginning to feel the pressure of a war on two fronts. The Luftwaffe, which had long been the backbone of Nazi Germany's military strength, was now facing an increasingly capable Allied Air Force, particularly the United States Army Air Force, USAF. The B-17 Flying Fortress, which had become a symbol of the USAF's strategic bombing campaign, was rapidly becoming one of the most significant threats to the Luftwaffe's dominance over European skies. The B-17, designed by Boeing and first flown in 1935, was a long-range heavy bomber equipped with multiple defensive machine guns and a bomb load that could devastate enemy targets. Its durability and ability to fly long distances made it ideal for the type of strategic bombing the USAF had planned. The idea behind the B-17 was simple: to bring the war to Germany's industrial heart by destroying its factories, railroads, and military installations. By 1943, these bombers had begun flying deep into German-occupied territory, targeting key infrastructure with devastating precision. As the B-17s took to the skies, they were escorted by American fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang, providing them with additional protection against German fighter aircraft. This combination of heavy bombers and fighter escorts marked a shift in Allied strategy. No longer were the bombers sitting ducks, easy targets for the nimble and aggressive German fighters. The introduction of fighter escorts meant that the B-17s could now penetrate deeper into enemy territory, with the Germans increasingly unable to prevent the destruction of their industrial infrastructure. For the German Luftwaffe, the sight of these bombers overhead was a sign that the war was changing. The Luftwaffe had been the uncontested ruler of the skies in the early years of the war, but by 1943, they were beginning to lose their grip on European air superiority. The introduction of the B-17s alongside other heavy bombers like the B-24 Liberator put the Luftwaffe on the defensive. German pilots, who had long been trained to engage in dogfights and intercept enemy bombers, found themselves facing a new kind of opponent, a heavily armed and well-defended formation of bombers that could no longer be easily destroyed by quick, hit-and-run tactics. German pilots, Particularly the aces, who had earned their status through years of aerial combat, were now confronted by the reality that their traditional methods of aerial combat, fighting in small, nimble planes and engaging in dogfights, were increasingly ineffective against the B-17s. The bombers, while slower and less agile, had an advantage that the German fighters could not easily overcome: overwhelming firepower and the ability to protect themselves with coordinated defenses. The B-17's defensive gunfire, combined with the P-47 and P-51 escorts, made it increasingly difficult for German pilots to approach them without incurring heavy losses. The German leadership, once confident in their aerial dominance, began to feel the sting of defeat in the skies. The Luftwaffe's attempts to intercept the B-17s were growing more desperate, as they realized that their existing tactics and aircraft could no longer guarantee success. The B-17 was not only a symbol of Allied industrial strength but also of the changing nature of the war, where air superiority was no longer solely the domain of the Luftwaffe. The American bombers and their escorts had forced the Germans to reconsider their strategies and tactics in the air, a shift that would have profound implications for the remainder of the war. For the elite German pilots, the realization that the skies were no longer theirs to command was both a professional and personal blow. These men had spent years honing their skills in the Luftwaffe, flying some of the best fighters in the world. Like the Bf-109 and the FW-190, they were aces, revered by their peers and feared by the Allies, often with kill counts that symbolized their dominance in the skies. Many of them had faced early success against Allied bombers, downing aircraft with relative ease. But by 1943, everything was changing. The introduction of the B-17, Flying Fortress, and the fighter escorts that accompanied them presented a new kind of challenge for these seasoned pilots. The first time many of the German pilots encountered a formation of B-17s, they were caught off guard. The B-17s, though large and not as nimble as their smaller German counterparts, were far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The bombers were heavily armed with multiple 50-caliber machine guns, and the sheer number of guns mounted on each aircraft made approaching them a deadly proposition. The German pilots, used to attacking in fast, agile formations that would target the weak points of enemy bombers, now found themselves facing a well-coordinated defense that was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The realization that their traditional tactics could not succeed against the B-17s was deeply unsettling. For the German aces, whose identity was often tied to their success in the skies, this represented a blow to their pride and professional skill. No longer could they engage in the swift, decisive aerial battles they had once mastered. Instead, they were forced into prolonged, costly engagements, trying and failing to break through the defensive fire of the bombers. The shock of facing a new type of adversary that could withstand their attacks and even retaliate was not just tactical but deeply psychological. The emotional toll of facing the B-17s was compounded by the mounting losses in the Luftwaffe. The once proud elite pilots, who had soared through the skies with confidence, now found themselves part of a dwindling force, increasingly outclassed by the superior numbers, tactics, and technology of the Allies. The sense of invincibility that had once defined the Luftwaffe was gone. German pilots began to realize that their dominance in the air was no longer a certainty. The psychological weight of this realization was profound. For many, it was a personal crisis that undermined their morale and made the war seem increasingly unwinnable. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not just a bomber. It was a weapon that shifted the very nature of aerial warfare in the European theater. Designed primarily as a long-range strategic bomber, the B-17's most innovative feature was its ability to defend itself. While bombers in previous wars were often considered easy targets for enemy fighters, the B-17 was different. It was equipped with multiple 50-caliber machine guns strategically placed around the aircraft, creating a dense and formidable defensive perimeter. The B-17 was designed to take on the Luftwaffe and survive. What made the B-17 so effective in combat was not just its armament, but its ability to work in formations of hundreds of aircraft. In these formations, the bombers would fly closely together, creating a wall of defensive fire that was nearly impossible for enemy fighters to penetrate. The German pilots, who had long relied on swift attacks and individual dogfights, now found themselves facing a new kind of opposition, a tightly coordinated, heavily armed, and well-protected bomber force. The B-17's role in the strategic bombing campaign was vital. The primary mission of these bombers was to destroy Germany's industrial and military infrastructure, crippling the Nazi war effort. The B-17s were tasked with targeting factories, oil refineries, transportation hubs, and military installations, key components of the German war machine. These bombers, along with their fighter escorts, began to fly deeper into German territory, striking at the heart of the Nazi regime. The Luftwaffe, once able to defend their airspace with relative ease, now found themselves increasingly overwhelmed by the sheer number and power of the Allied bombing formations. The tactical effectiveness of the B-17s lay not only in their ability to destroy key targets, but also in their ability to force the Luftwaffe to divert resources from the front lines to protect their homeland. As more B-17s arrived in Europe and the U.S. Army Air Force expanded its bombing campaigns, the German military was forced to allocate more and more fighters to defend against these bombers, depleting their resources and leaving other areas vulnerable. The B-17s, with their impressive range and heavy defensive armament, changed the way the Allies approached warfare in Europe. They were no longer just tools of destruction. They were strategic assets that could cripple the enemy's ability to fight. The B-17's success was also a result of the development of fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, which would eventually ensure the bombers' safety on long-range missions. The combined forces of bombers and fighters created a new tactical framework that rendered the Luftwaffe ineffective in its defense of Germany. As more bombers took to the skies and more enemy fighters were destroyed in the process, the Luftwaffe found it increasingly difficult to maintain its air dominance. The B-17, with its strategic purpose and unmatched defensive capabilities, marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's control over the skies. The turning point in the war, particularly for the Luftwaffe, came when the B-17 flying fortresses began executing their strategic bombing raids deeper into Germany in 1943, with greater frequency and coordination than ever before. While Germany had been prepared for raids on industrial targets, they were not prepared for the intensity of the attacks or for the resilience of the American bombers. These raids were no longer mere distractions or probing strikes. They were precise, calculated efforts to destroy the very heart of the German war machine. On the morning of July 17, 1943, the U.S. Army Air Force launched Operation Gomorrah, one of the largest and most devastating bombing raids on Hamburg, Germany. It was the first true demonstration of the full power of the American strategic bombing campaign. Over the next few months, the Allies sent wave after wave of B-17 flying fortresses to destroy German industrial centers. As the bombers relentlessly pounded Germany's infrastructure, the Luftwaffe struggled to mount a coherent defense. The German pilots, many of whom had long been accustomed to facing enemy bombers in the air, were stunned by the sheer scale of these attacks. The B-17s, armed with extensive defensive weaponry and flying in tight formations, were no longer easy targets. They had a reputation for being nearly indestructible. And this reputation was now a terrifying reality for the German pilots. As the Thunderbolts and Mustangs escorted the B-17s on long-range missions deep into enemy territory, the Luftwaffe found itself stretched thin. The once robust defenses of the German airfields were no longer sufficient to fend off the overwhelming strength of the American bomber formations. In the face of such overwhelming opposition, the German pilots, who had once dominated the skies, began to lose their nerve. As they engaged the B-17s in dogfights, many found themselves outmatched and outgunned. The B-17s, with their strong defensive firepower and the superior tactical coordination of the American fighter escorts, had become the unrelenting force in the skies. The German pilots, aces who had once ruled the European sky, now found themselves helpless against this new form of aerial warfare. The turning point was clear. The B-17s, with their relentless bombing campaigns and highly coordinated escorts, had broken the back of the Luftwaffe's air defense strategy. The psychological toll on the German pilots was immense. They had spent years believing in their ability to protect the skies over Germany. But now, with the rise of American air power, they were no longer in control. The strategic bombing campaign had not only crippled their industrial centers, but had shattered the Luftwaffe's morale, forcing the Germans to adapt to a reality where they could no longer guarantee control of the skies. For the American pilots, this marked a moment of triumph. The B-17 Flying Fortress, once seen as a vulnerable target, had proven its worth beyond any expectation. The Thunderbolts and Mustangs that escorted these bombers had proven that they could provide the necessary protection for the bombers to complete their missions deep within German territory. The success of these campaigns signaled the beginning of the end for Germany's ability to defend its airspace. The turning point, however, was not only about the destruction of planes and infrastructure, it was about the psychological effect it had on the German war effort. The loss of their ability to defend their airfields, their industries, and their cities was a devastating blow that would reverberate throughout the German military. For the Luftwaffe, this moment marked the end of their reign in the skies, a realization that their air superiority was slipping away. As the B-17s and their fighter escorts continued to rain destruction down on their airfields and factories, the Luftwaffe's ability to defend their homeland was crippled. Their once dominant role in the war was coming to an end. The pivotal moment for the Luftwaffe came on the morning of August 17, 1943, what would later be called Black Thursday. On that day, the U.S. Army Air Force launched a massive daylight bombing raid on the German city of Schweinfurt, one of Germany's most important ball-bearing production centers. The objective was clear: cripple the German war machine by targeting vital industrial components. The American B-17 Flying Fortress, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts and other fighters, set out for the heart of Nazi Germany's industrial sector, intent on wreaking havoc. What the Luftwaffe didn't expect, however, was the ferocity and resilience of these American bombers. The B-17s, flying in tight formations and accompanied by the robust fighter escorts, presented a challenge the Luftwaffe could not easily overcome. The German fighters, still hoping to engage in their traditional hit-and-run tactics, quickly found themselves overwhelmed by the bombers' coordinated defenses. The B-17s, with their heavy firepower, coupled with the escorting fighters, were an impenetrable force. In the battle over Schweinfurt, the Luftwaffe's best pilots were thrown into combat against a determined American force. Despite their considerable skill and experience, many German pilots were left with few options. The P-47 Thunderbolts, which had proven their worth as both bomber escorts and formidable adversaries in their own right, fought alongside the B-17s, cutting down German fighters that dared to engage the bombers. The battle turned into a catastrophic defeat for the Luftwaffe as they lost dozens of their best pilots and aircraft. For the first time, they were unable to halt the B-17's progress, and the vital industrial target was destroyed. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived the battle were left in shock. They had been taught that no enemy could penetrate their defenses, that the skies over Germany were theirs to control. But this battle, and others like it, signaled the death knell of German air superiority. The American strategic bombing campaign was not just a military endeavor, it was a psychological one. For the German aces who had once been untouchable, the sight of the B-17s soaring above them was a brutal reminder that their time in the skies was coming to an end. This attack on Schweinfurt was a massive, blow not just to German industry, but to the Luftwaffe's morale. The pilots, many of whom had spent years fighting in the skies over Europe, now found themselves unable to stop the American bombers. The B-17s, which had once been considered vulnerable targets, were now proving themselves as resilient and relentless, far more than the Germans had anticipated. This was the turning point, a moment when the German pilots, no longer able to defend their skies, realized they were fighting a losing battle. For the American pilots, the triumph over the Luftwaffe was nothing short of monumental. Their ability to protect the B-17s, even in the face of fierce German resistance, marked a major tactical victory. The B-17s had survived the toughest challenges thrown at them and, with the support of their escorts, had carried out their mission successfully. The victory at Schweinfurt, while costly, was a turning point that demonstrated the power of the combined forces of the U.S. Army Air Force and their fighters. The B-17s, with their overwhelming firepower and protection, had proven that they could strike deep into the heart of Nazi Germany and cripple its industrial war effort. The shift in the balance of power in the skies was unmistakable. The B-17 had once been vulnerable in the hands of the Americans, but now, with their escorting fighters and improved tactics, they were proving to be an indomitable force. For the Luftwaffe, the reality was brutal. They could no longer maintain air superiority, and their airfields, once considered invulnerable, were now the prime targets of Allied bombers. The psychological toll on the German pilots was immense. Once confident in their ability to dominate the skies, they were now fighting to defend a shrinking empire, one that was increasingly beyond their reach. This moment, marked by the brutal raid on Schweinfurt and the overwhelming presence of the B-17s, was the beginning of the end for Germany's ability to contest Allied air superiority. The psychological impact of seeing the once dominant Luftwaffe utterly overwhelmed by a new kind of warfare, a sustained, coordinated bombing campaign, was immense. The B-17s were no longer just symbols of American might. They were the harbingers of a new era of warfare where strategic bombing and long-range air superiority would determine the outcome of the conflict. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Schweinfurt and similar Allied air raids, the Luftwaffe found itself in a state of disarray. The once formidable aerial defense of Nazi Germany had been effectively shattered. The B-17s, with their relentless bombing raids and the overwhelming support from Allied fighters, had struck at the heart of Germany's military power. Their airfields, factories, and strategic industries. For the German High Command, this marked the collapse of their ability to maintain control over the skies. The Luftwaffe's elite pilots, who had been trained to view themselves as the dominant force in the air, were now facing the harsh reality that their superiority was no longer a given. The B-17s, despite being slower and less agile, had proven to be a more formidable adversary than the Luftwaffe had anticipated. They could withstand damage, fly long distances, and deliver devastating strikes on critical targets. And when accompanied by fighter escorts like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang, they were virtually untouchable. The psychological toll on the German pilots was profound. Many of the Luftwaffe's top aces, who had previously dominated the skies in their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, were now being forced to face an enemy they could not defeat. The P-47s and P-51s not only outclassed their aircraft but provided unrelenting cover for the bombers, making it increasingly difficult for the German pilots to engage in the kind of aerial combat that had once been their specialty. The loss of air superiority, something the Luftwaffe had always taken for granted, was a blow to their confidence and morale. This shift had strategic consequences far beyond the immediate losses. As the B-17s and their escorts continued their bombing runs, Germany's ability to produce and maintain aircraft, fuel, and other war materials was severely disrupted. The strategic bombing campaign targeted not only Luftwaffe airfields, but also the factories that produced the very planes that Germany relied on for defense. The Allies, in effect, were bombing Germany's ability to fight back. This attack on German infrastructure was a key turning point in the war, as it eroded the Luftwaffe's capacity to continue its defense of the Reich. For the American forces, the success of the B-17 raids signaled a major victory. Not only had they inflicted severe damage on German industrial and military infrastructure, but they had proven that American bombers were no longer just defenseless targets. They were a force to be reckoned with. The heavy losses the Luftwaffe sustained in these raids marked the beginning of the end for German air superiority. The B-17s, with their durability and defensive firepower, had shown the German pilots that the days of uncontested dominance in the skies were over. The Luftwaffe, in the face of these mounting losses, had no clear answer. Their once elite fighter pilots were now struggling against a force that had not only adapted to their tactics, but had turned the tide in their favor. The impact of losing control of the air, particularly over Germany itself, was felt throughout the German military. The Luftwaffe was no longer able to maintain a constant defense of the homeland, and this shift contributed to the overall erosion of Germany's strategic position in the war. The once dominant German Air Force was now on the defensive, unable to halt the relentless advance of Allied air power. For the German civilian population, the aftermath of these raids was equally devastating. While the war had already brought hardship and destruction to Germany, the intensified Allied bombing campaign meant that civilian infrastructure was also targeted. Factories, transportation hubs, and residential areas were all struck by the American bombs, further straining the country's ability to maintain its war effort. The destruction of airfields and industrial centers not only weakened the Luftwaffe, but crippled Germany's ability to support its military operations. The reality of total war was becoming ever clearer to the German people, as they witnessed firsthand the scale of destruction that was now being unleashed upon their homeland. In the months that followed, the Luftwaffe's attempts to fight back were met with increasingly limited success. The damage to their airfields was not something they could quickly repair, and the loss of experienced pilots further compounded their problems. While some new aircraft were introduced, they were not enough to overcome the mounting disadvantages the Luftwaffe faced. The P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and B-17 Flying Fortresses had proven to be a devastating combination that the Luftwaffe could no longer defeat with its traditional tactics. For the American pilots, the aftermath was a sense of vindication. The B-17, once seen as vulnerable, had proven itself as a key element of the Allies' strategic bombing campaign. The success of the B-17 raids against German airfields and industrial centers represented a victory not just in terms of material destruction, but in the psychological war against the Germans. The Luftwaffe, once seen as invincible, was now shown to be powerless in the face of the overwhelming power of the Allied air forces. The air superiority the Germans had once enjoyed was now firmly in the hands of the Allies, and the way forward for the Allied forces was clear. In the wake of the Luftwaffe's defeat in the skies over Germany, the strategic and psychological impacts were profound. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of Nazi strength and a central pillar of German military power, was now a shadow of its former self. The destruction of airfields, the loss of aircraft and pilots, and the inability to defend against the constant Allied bombing raids signaled the collapse of Germany's air defenses. With their ability to intercept Allied bombers and protect their airspace severely compromised, Germany's military leadership could no longer rely on their once dominant air force to safeguard the Reich. For the German High Command, the loss of air superiority was not just a tactical blow, it was a devastating strategic setback. Germany's entire military strategy had been built on the foundation of air dominance. The Luftwaffe had provided air support for ground operations, had defended German territory, and had delivered critical strikes against Allied supply lines. With the Luftwaffe in disarray, Germany's ability to wage war on multiple fronts was severely limited. The loss of key industrial centers, transport hubs, and military airfields meant that the Germans were no longer able to sustain their war effort in the same way. Their ability to produce aircraft, munitions, and fuel had been devastated, and the relentless bombing of their infrastructure left them vulnerable to further Allied advances. For the Luftwaffe pilots, the aftermath of their defeat was both physical and psychological. The aces who had once commanded the skies found themselves fighting a battle they could no longer win. The relentless attacks on their airfields, their factories, and their supply lines left them with fewer resources and fewer planes to fight with. The psychological toll on these pilots was immense. They had been trained to believe in their superiority, and for many of them, the loss of the skies was an emotional blow that was difficult to come to terms with. They had once believed they could hold back the Allied forces, but now, faced with the technological advancements and relentless pressure of the American bombers, they were powerless to stop the advancing tide. As the months passed, the Luftwaffe's morale continued to erode. Experienced pilots were lost, and the new generation of German fighters, though advanced, were unable to replace the seasoned veterans who had been lost in combat. The American bombers, now escorted by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang, were free to strike at will. The Luftwaffe's inability to defend Germany's airspace meant that the Allies could carry out air raids with impunity, hitting key military targets, industrial centers, and transportation hubs without fear of effective retaliation. For the Allies, the success of their strategic bombing campaigns was a decisive factor in the eventual defeat of Germany. The B-17 Flying Fortress, once considered a vulnerable target, had proven to be one of the most effective weapons in the Allied arsenal. It had crippled Germany's ability to fight back, destroying airfields, factories, and supply lines, while its ability to take damage and continue flying had allowed it to sustain its attacks despite fierce resistance. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that escorted the bombers had proven just as crucial, providing the necessary protection to ensure that the bombers could complete their missions without being wiped out by the Luftwaffe. The loss of German air superiority had far-reaching consequences. With the skies above Germany now in Allied hands, the Germans found it increasingly difficult to defend their territories. The Luftwaffe could no longer disrupt Allied bombers, leaving them vulnerable to destruction. The final stages of the war would see the Allies using air superiority to their advantage, supporting ground operations and crippling German industry from the air. The destruction of the Luftwaffe and the loss of air superiority had a ripple effect across the entire Nazi war effort. The inability to defend their skies contributed to the collapse of Germany's war economy, and the German military's inability to recover from its air losses hastened the collapse of the Nazi regime. With their industrial centers in ruins and their air defenses shattered, Germany's capacity to continue the war was effectively crippled. The Luftwaffe's defeat, coupled with the advancing Allied forces on the ground, signaled the imminent end of Nazi Germany's power. For the American forces, the aftermath of the Luftwaffe's defeat was one of triumph. The B-17 Flying Fortress, once considered a vulnerable asset, had proven itself to be a game-changer in the strategic bombing campaign. With the destruction of German airfields, the U.S. Army Air Force had paved the way for the final stages of the war. The bombing campaigns, aided by long-range fighters and heavy bombers like the B-17, had crippled Germany's ability to fight back. The strategic bombing raids had not only destroyed vital military infrastructure, but had also significantly weakened the morale of the German military and civilian population. For the American pilots, the victory over the Luftwaffe was a hard-earned triumph, but it was also a reminder of the human cost of war. They had fought valiantly to secure air superiority, but they had also witnessed the devastating effects of the bombing campaigns on German cities and infrastructure. The B-17s, once considered a vulnerable target, had proven to be the backbone of the American strategic bombing campaign and had helped bring the war in Europe to its final stages. The destruction of the Luftwaffe, particularly the crippling blows dealt by the American B-17 flying fortresses, marked a turning point not only in the war, but in the history of aerial combat. The German pilots, once the most feared in the world, faced an adversary they could neither defeat nor adapt to. The B-17, with its durability, overwhelming firepower, and the cover of long-range fighter escorts, was an unstoppable force that changed the course of the war in Europe. The psychological and tactical impact of the loss of German air superiority cannot be overstated. It wasn't just the destruction of aircraft and airfields, it was the collapse of the belief in the Luftwaffe's invincibility. For the German pilots, their transformation from the rulers of the sky to a retreating force mirrored the broader collapse of the Third Reich. For the American pilots, the victory was bittersweet. They had triumphed over the formidable Luftwaffe, but they had also witnessed the devastation wrought by their own actions. The B-17s, which had once been seen as vulnerable targets, had become a symbol of the relentless advance of Allied air power. The campaign had not been without cost. Many American pilots had paid the ultimate price. Yet the defeat of the Luftwaffe and the subsequent loss of Germany's ability to defend its skies were pivotal moments in securing the ultimate Allied victory. The B-17 Flying Fortress, once underestimated and seen as an easy target, had proven to be a weapon of war that transcended its role as a mere bomber. It was a tool of strategic warfare that embodied the changing nature of modern conflict. The victory in the skies over Europe represented not just technological superiority, but a shift in the very approach to warfare. The days of dogfights between agile fighters had given way to large-scale aerial campaigns where overwhelming firepower, strategic bombing, and long-range fighters dictated the terms of battle. The destruction of the Luftwaffe was as much a victory of strategy as it was of technology, demonstrating the power of adaptation and innovation in warfare. In the broader scope of history, the defeat of the Luftwaffe marked the end of an era for Germany. The Luftwaffe had been a symbol of Nazi strength, an embodiment of Hitler's vision of military dominance. But as the B-17s soared over German skies, it became clear that Nazi Germany's power, especially in the air, was no longer what it had once been. The Allied bombing campaigns, with their relentless targeting of Germany's industrial heart and the destruction of the Luftwaffe, contributed to the collapse of the Third Reich. The bombers, though seen initially as vulnerable, had proven to be an essential element in the defeat of one of the most powerful military forces in history. The victory over the Luftwaffe not only symbolized the collapse of Nazi Germany's military might, but also ushered in a new era of warfare, one where air power played an increasingly dominant role. The legacy of the B-17 Flying Fortress and the men who flew it would resonate for years to come. It was a testament to the importance of strategic thinking, technological advancement, and the ability to adapt to a changing battlefield. In the end, the fall of the Luftwaffe was not just the loss of an air force, it was the loss of a dream. It was the collapse of a regime that had built its identity around military prowess, only to find itself overwhelmed by a more resilient and resourceful enemy. For the German pilots who had once ruled the skies, the loss of their superiority was a painful reminder that no force, no matter how mighty, can remain invincible forever. And for the Allies, it was a reminder that, even in the darkest times, innovation and adaptation could turn the tide of war.